of the south, the way mist clung to the grass in the morning. It calmed the tumult in her soul.
Welsh,
Today, the cherry trees along the driveway were in full pink bloom. Ethel had been right all those years ago when she'd said that riding horses was restorative to one's sense of peace.
35-pound.
Frankie loved the undulating green fields, the black four-rail fencing, the trees that changed their color with the weather. Now, the leaves were the bright lime hue of new growth and full of pink blossoms. But mostly, it was being around the horses that calmed Frankie. Ethel had been right about that. Riding had steadied Frankie as much as friendship had. Frankie ducked through the empty space between fence rails and headed into the barn. She could barely see her boots, the mist was so thick and gray. Inside, the barn smelled of manure and fresh bales of hay and the grain they stored in large metal garbage cans. The horses nickered at her as she passed. At the last stall on the left, she paused and lifted the latch. Silver Birch walked toward her, lips moving, looking for treats, breath snorting. "Hey, girl," Frankie said, holding out her gloved hand. Silver ate the grain messily, more falling to the ground than getting in her mouth. Frankie led the mare out into the aisle and saddled her quickly, pressing a knee to the mare's belly to aid her in tightening the girth. In no time, Frankie and Silver were out on the trails, galloping through the mist. When Silver started to sound winded, Frankie slowed the mare to a trot, then a walk. They walked home slowly, clomping at a steady, calming pace. Back in the barn, she fed and watered the horses, turned Silver out, and headed back to the small bunkhouse. Early morning sunlight drenched the fields. Off to the left was the main house with its steeply pitched roof, large and welcoming porch, and whitewashed wooden sides, where Ethel lived with her father. Well off to the right was the bunkhouse that had once boarded farm workers. Over the past 18 months, it had been remodeled into a two-bedroom cottage where Frankie and Barb lived. The three women had learned how to paint, demolish, rebuild, and do rudimentary plumbing. They'd spent hours haunting garage sales and hauling other people's junk to be their treasures. Many evenings were spent sitting around the sooty River Rock fireplace talking. They never ran out of things to say. Frankie climbed the few steps and went into the bunkhouse's only bathroom, where she showered, changed, and dressed for work. She was out of the house and on her way to work before Barb was even out of bed. At the end of a 12-hour shift in the OR, Frankie waved goodbye to her coworkers and headed out to her car, a dented old Ford Falcon that she and Barb shared, and jumped in. On the way out of town, she popped a John Denver tape into the 8-track and sang along. She drove to the tavern where Barb currently worked and parked among the battered old trucks of the regulars who were there this time of day. Barb's bicycle stood slanted against the rough exterior plank wall. Inside, the place was dark and musty smelling, with sawdust on the floors and bar stools worn to a velvet feel by 100 years of faithful customers. Barb had worked here for the past few months. It was not a job she intended to keep much longer, or so she often said. Soon she'd look for something higher end, nearer to the city, where the tips were better, but this was close to the farm and gave her lots of time to volunteer for her causes. Now she stood behind the bar, a soggy bar rag over one shoulder, a red, white, and blue cotton kerchief over her afro. Huge gold hoop earrings caught the light. Frankie sidled up onto a bar stool. "Hey there." "Jed, I'm taking a break," Barb called out. A moment later, her boss, Jed, shuffled out from the office and took his place behind the bar. Barb grabbed a pair of cold beers and led the way out back to one of the picnic tables. Come summer, the bar would sell house-smoked barbecue on red plastic plates, but not till the weather warmed up. Frankie took the beer, snapped the cap, and took a long drink, leaning back against the table, stretching her legs out. She glanced at Barb, frowned, and said, "What's wrong?" "You can read my thoughts now?" "This is not a new skill, Barbara. What's up?" "Damn it, I was going to ease my way into it." She sighed. "I have a favor to ask." "Anything, you know that." "It's for all of them," Barb said. "Finley and Jamie and Ryan, all the fallen." Frankie flinched. The names were rarely mentioned between them. Barb and Ethel still worried that Frankie was fragile and could slide too easily back into grief, and they were right to be concerned. Frankie still sometimes woke up and for a split second forgot that Ryan was gone and reached for him. "The VVAW are meeting in Washington next week to protest. Guerrilla theater, they're calling it. Vietnam Veterans Against the War." "You know I'm not interested. You've asked before," Frankie said. "I'm not a marcher. This is special. Trust me. We aren't the only group that will march. We want to create a media event so big Nixon has to notice." Barb looked at her. "Come with me." "Barb, you know I try not to think about over there. I know, and I respect the effort. I know how hard it's been for you, but they're still dying in the jungle, Frankie. Dying for a lost war, and, well, you told me to do something for Will. This is what I'm doing." "Not fair throwing my words back at me." I know. It's shitty, but we're believers, you and me," Barb said. "As bend around as we've been, and as much as we've seen, we're patriots." "No one wants patriots anymore," Frankie said. "I can't wear an army t-shirt off the property or I'll be spit on. The country thinks we're monsters. But I won't disrespect the troops. It's not disrespectful to protest, Frankie. We have that wrong. It takes guts to stand up and demand a change. We're vets. Shouldn't our voices be heard in protest too? Shouldn't they be loud?" Barb pulled a folded-out magazine page out of her back pocket, smoothed out the wrinkles, and laid it out on the table. It was a full-page ad in Playboy for the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The picture was of a solitary coffin draped in an American flag. The headline read, "In the last 10 years, over 335,000 of our buddies have been killed or wounded in Vietnam, and more are being killed every day. We don't think it's worth it." In the bottom corner of the ad was a plea to join us. Frankie stared at the advertisement. Since the tide of public opinion had turned so clearly against the war, more and more numbers of the wounded and fallen were being reported. It was tough to see in print. So many young men killed, while others were still being shipped over, spun up. The press wasn't blindly reporting what Nixon wanted them to anymore. Journalists had been granted access to the troops. They witnessed the battles, reported on the dead. This week, a female journalist from Australia had been among a group captured by the People's Army of Vietnam and taken prisoner. Kate Webb. Everyone should now know that women were in Vietnam too. Frankie took a deep breath, exhaled. Barb said, Slim told me once that the average life expectancy of a helicopter pilot in Vietnam is 30 days. I know, I've heard that too. I don't know if it's true. We have to stop it, Barb said. Us, the ones who paid the price. It was wrong, criminal, the way the US government was failing the military. But what could a handful of veterans do to stop a war? People like Barb had been marching for years, and what good had it done? Protest seemed futile, maybe even unpatriotic. But men were dying over there, crashing in helicopters and stepping on landmines and getting shot by an enemy they never saw. How could she not protest that, at least? We could be arrested, Frankie said. They could call in the National Guard. We could be tear gassed or shot at, Barb said sullenly, then added, like at Kent State in Jackson. Way to look at the bright side. This isn't a joke, Barb said. The old white men who run this country are scared, and people do stupid, ugly things when they're scared. She leaned close. But they're counting on their power and our fear. And every minute, some woman's son is being killed over there. Some girl's brother. Frankie didn't want to march. She didn't want to think about Vietnam and what it had cost her. She wanted to do what she'd been trying to do for more than 2 years. Forget. It was dangerous, what Barb was asking of Frankie, and upsetting of an already precariously balanced peace in Frankie's mind. No fear, McGrath. Jamie's voice in her head. Barb was right. Frankie needed to do this. As a veteran of Vietnam, and for Finley and Jamie and Rye, she had to add her voice to the rising scream of dissent. She had to say, no more. Just this once, Frankie said. She regretted it, almost instantly. On the day before the march, Frankie had trouble concentrating at work. In between surgeries, she worried about what lay ahead. Her mind obsessively scrolled through the violence that had marked so many rallies and protests. Nixon had sent the National Guard in to stop a peaceful protest at Kent State less than a year ago. When the smoke cleared, 4 students were dead and dozens wounded. Only 11 days later, the police had shot students at a Jackson State College war protest. But the truth was that although she worried about violence at the march, she worried more about standing there with other veterans, saying, I was there. For the past 2 years, she'd hidden that fact at every opportunity, changed the conversation when Vietnam came up. Even Barb and Ethel rarely mentioned Vietnam. Frankie knew their silence was to protect her, and on good days, she knew it helped. On bad days, she worried that she couldn't forget because there was something wrong with her, something broken. In time, hiding her service and not talking about it had allowed shame to take root. She was never exactly sure what she was ashamed of, just that she was weak or had somehow done something bad, been a part of something bad, something no one wanted to talk about. Maybe it was simply being a part of the apparent breakdown of American honor. She didn't know. On the way home, she tried to figure out what the hell one should wear to a protest meeting. She decided on hip-hugger jeans with a wide Western-style belt and a ribbed white turtleneck. She dried her hair down straight from the center part. At the last minute, she went in search of her ANC pin, a brass caduceus with its wings behind a bold N, and pinned it on her sweater. Leaving her bedroom, she shut the door behind her. In the kitchen, Barb and Ethel were talking quietly. Barb wore her old stained fatigue pants with a black turtleneck and a Levi's jacket with the sleeves cut off. Dozens of the pins and patches she'd collected from friends and patients in Vietnam decorated the front of the vest. She'd drawn a big black peace symbol on the back. She painted a Bring Them Home sign and stapled it to a yardstick. Ethel, wearing her blue lab coat, poured herself a cup of coffee. I don't know how Barb talked you into this, Frank. The VVAW is as sexist as the SDS, she added. If you girls show up, they'll ask you to make coffee and do snack runs. Those who stay behind don't get rich, Barb said.
What?
Disappointingly, Frankie said glumly. The 3 of them had spent at least an hour last night sitting around the fire pit in the backyard, wrapped in woolen blankets, discussing today's march. Barb had said that more than a dozen anti-war groups were scheduled to arrive in D.C. in the next few days. The VVAW wanted to separate themselves by marching first. They had big plans to draw attention to themselves, make them news broadcasts. Just be careful, Ethel said. Be home on time or I'm calling the police. Barb laughed. If we get into trouble, it will be with the police. Frankie stared at her friend. Comments like that are not helpful. Come on, kid, Barb said. We're making like the wind and blowing. Ethel hugged Frankie and said, Go with God, girls. Change the world. Frankie followed Barb out to the car and got into the passenger seat. Barb started the car and cranked up the music on Credence. Barb turned, smiling. You ready? Frankie sighed. Her nerves were strung taut. This whole thing was a mistake. Just drive, Barbara. It was nearing midnight when they pulled into D.C. Their destination, Potomac Park, was a black expanse in the middle of the brightly lit city. In the darkness, Frankie could make out tents here and there. The VVAW had occupied the park, turned it into a campground. Let's find a spot off to ourselves, Frankie said. Barb parked the car on the side of the street. Get the tent out of the trunk. Across the street, a long line of policemen in riot gear stood shoulder to shoulder. Don't say anything, Frankie warned as they passed the policemen on their way to the park. I mean it. I'm not getting arrested before the march. Barb gave a curt nod. They came to the edge of the large park. Saying nothing, not to each other and not to the other VVAW campers, they pitched their tent, then set up 2 chairs out front. As they sat in the dark, listening to the din of tent spikes being pounded into the ground, more and more cars drove up, headlights spearing through the night. They heard music in the distance and the quiet buzz of conversations. I wonder if we are the only women, Frankie said, drinking coffee from a thermos. Barb sighed. Are we always? In the morning, when Frankie stepped out of the tent, she found herself standing amid a veritable sea of male veterans. Thousands, most of them about her age, wearing worn, stained fatigues and jeans and boonie hats. Some wore peace symbols and carried flags from their states, their units. Hundreds of cars were parked near the park, their doors emblazoned with slogans, convoys from California and Colorado. More had parked on the grass. As she stood there, a battered, beaten-up school bus drove up onto the grass, stopped, and opened its doors. Veterans exited the bus, singing, "What's it good for? Absolutely nothing." In the center of the park, a bushy-haired man with a bullhorn jumped up into the back of a pickup truck onto which someone had spray-painted "No More." "My brothers in arms, it's time. We're marching to be heard today. We're raising our voices, but not our fists, not our guns, to say enough. Bring our soldiers home. Line up behind Ron in the wheelchair, a single unbroken column. Be peaceful. Don't give the man any reason to stop us. Let's go." The men slowly formed a column, led by several veterans in wheelchairs who held flags. Behind them were men on crutches, men with burned faces and missing arms, blind men being led by their friends. Barb and Frankie were the only two women in the park that they could see. They held hands and joined their brothers on the march across the Lincoln Memorial Bridge. Vietnam veterans, a river of them, marching and chanting, holding signs in the air. More men joined them, rushed forward, yelling out slogans, signs raised. Someone bumped into Frankie so hard that she stumbled sideways, lost her hold on Barb's hand, and fell to the ground. She yelled, "Barb!" and heard, "Frankie!" but men swarmed in between them. Frankie couldn't see her friend in the crowd. "Meet back at the tent!" she yelled, hoping Barb could hear. "You okay, ma'am?" A man helped her to her feet. He was young, blond, with a scraggly reddish-blonde beard and mustache. He held on to her upper arm, steadied her. He wore torn, stained jungle fatigues with the sleeves cut off. He'd drawn a huge peace symbol on his helmet. In his other hand, he held a sign that read "Vietnam veterans against the war." The protesters kept moving, shoving the two of them forward. "Stop the war! Bring them home! Stop the war! Bring them home!" "You should move to the side now," he said. Someone jostled Frankie again. She stumbled. "I'm here to march." "Sorry, lady, this march is for vets."